Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much for coming out on this lovely spring day for a very unusual panel discussion, OSHER panel discussion, one of the few that we do. And if they're successful, we may do some others in the future. On behalf of OSHER, my name is Tom Blinkhorn. I'm very involved with OSHER at Dartmouth. And I'm on behalf of the president, Sylvia Paxton, the lady with the green scarf today. She wore it because we have actually an Irish panel, as you probably have discerned. Now, there's one surprise here that I should tell you about right away before I turn it over to our moderator, and that is, this is not Jim Heffernan. And the reason Jim is not here is that the plane that he was going to take from Charlottesville, Virginia, was canceled. So he apologizes to everyone. He will be in the Upper Valley in Hanover in a few weeks. So very fortunately, I call it a stroke of Celtic luck. Edward Bradley managed to get one of the sterling members of the Dartmouth alumni to join us, and he will tell you who she is. I'm going to stop now and turn it over to my friend and esteemed colleague, professor of classics, teacher since 1963, one of the stalwarts of the academia in Hanover and the world, for that matter, Edward Bradley.
Is this, yeah, this is working. Tom, and all of you in the audience whom I welcome warmly. Tom, I want to thank you especially for your myotic role in creating this occasion. It's a word I've been wanting to use with Tom, and I dare to use it in the presence of this highly cultured, well-educated audience. But Tom is the inspiration for this afternoon's occasion and has been dogged and determined and cheerful in the face of success, but also some adversity. And it is true, Jim Heffernan did not have a last-minute sex change operation. It was an airplane. It was an airplane that didn't work. So here is Marianne, and I'll say more about her in a few minutes. Before we actually begin our discussion this afternoon, I want to say a few words about how we plan to proceed. Our program is ambitious, we know that, and we hope even so to engage as many of you as possible so that you will stay with us right through to the end. No departures for early bird specials at any one of the local hostelries. During the first part, each of our three panelists will make brief presentations that will be followed by discussion among themselves and or by questions put to them by me. Thereupon, we will turn to you for your own questions and observations. In order that for as many of you as possible may be heard, we ask only that your remarks be succinct. Please stay with us, even though our distinguished panelists may have much to say about why do we need the humanities. Your voices are very important to us, and we want to hear from you as well. Our discussion of the role and need for the humanities is unusually timely. For we have before us for our consideration today, here at Dartmouth, two signs, as it were, that express the college's understanding of its mission as a liberal arts institution. On the one hand, there is the seal of the college, with its Latin motto, Vox clamantis in deserto, taken from the book of the prophet Isaiah, chapter 40. The voice of one calling out in the wilderness. With all that these words tell us, not only about the college's actual location in the New Hampshire wilderness of 1769, but also about its founding purposes. Parate viam Domini, prepare the way of the Lord. That is, prepare the way of the Lord. On the other hand, there was the Dartmouth webpage of the last week of this past February, on which was prominently displayed for several days the upper body image of a happy graduate, displaying proudly his new Dartmouth diploma. He was fully attired in academic regalia, with a hood indicating his fresh degree in engineering. Across his face ran the words, "Return on investment," while across his chest we see in even bolder print, "Life after Dartmouth." The question that is before us today is, at least in part, how are we to interpret these two messages for today's Dartmouth? I will begin now with a brief introduction of Sheila Gallagher, who will then make her presentation. She is an associate professor of fine art at Boston College, where she teaches courses in drawing, mixed media, and contemporary art practice. She has exhibited her work at various galleries and museums, including the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, the ICA, and Crystal Bridges Museum. She is a trustee of the St. Gaudens National Historic Park and co-director of the Baker Collection of Civil War Drawings. It is with pleasure that I introduce to you Sheila Gallagher.
First, thank you to all of you for coming out on this beautiful sunny day when you should probably be outside drawing a picture or reading a poem. But I'm glad you came here instead. And thank you to Ed for getting us going here on the humanities and really laying out the schizophrenic split nature of the discussion of the value of the humanities, which, coarsely put, is to make money on the one hand and to make meaning on the other. Cardinal Newman put it more eloquently when he captured the dichotomy, speaking of the tension between useful knowledge and liberal knowledge. That is, knowledge that is valued for its presence in us without any direct end. I wasn't going to show any slides, but I thought, since I'm an artist and I traffic in mute images, you should probably have something. An example of my own, of an early project with no direct end. What you see here is a live flower installation that was up at the Boston Center for the Arts in 1999 for about 2 months. It is based, obviously, on Monet's Giverny, one of his bridges at Giverny from 1899. And it is made up of, it's about 12 feet by 12 feet with 1,200 gallons of water running through it, and with pipes at the top which watered it. And to keep it going, I had to go to the flower exchange every day and buy flowers for the ones that were dying and replace them, looking for the brushstrokes at the flower market itself. The Boston Center for the Arts was supposed to give me a grant to keep it going, but they didn't get their grant money. And so on one sad, rainy day, I had to take all of my grandmother's golf trophies. She was an amateur golf champion before women could go pro, and I bundled them all up and brought them to the Silver Lady in Newton, where I sold them all to keep the flower installation in hydrangeas for another month. And so there we have the use of the liberal arts without making money. So there are, you can make a case that the major in English or philosophy will allow you to excel at Shark Tank or get a decent job. It is not a difficult case to make. And there are tons of articles out there in places like Forbes and Slate and Fast Company that speak to the fact that CEOs in both finance and tech are discovering that liberal arts thinking makes them stronger. Surprise, surprise. Students who study the humanities know how to read. They're well trained in writing. They can develop persuasive arguments, all sorts of great things. Because I originally thought I was going to speak for 20 minutes, but now I'm told I should sort of keep it shorter, 8. I don't want to focus too much on utility to begin with, the measurability of the economic case for the humanities, or the particular marketability, say, of a studio art major, because I actually think that takes away from the more difficult, the more interesting, the more fun work of explaining the humanities' broader purposes and gifts. As Drew Gilpin Faust said, she gave a wonderful sesquicentennial speech at Boston College a couple of years ago. And she, if you can get your hands on it, it's fantastic and speaks directly to the concerns of this panel. She said, by focusing on education as an engine of material prosperity, we risk distorting what a university should and must be. We cannot let our need to make a living overwhelm our aspiration to lead a life worth living. In many ways, I feel very fortunate to teach at a Jesuit university, which, while BC is not terribly arty, and that's a problem for me, is constantly questioning what we are doing beyond knowledge acquisition, keeping the wound open by asking, in the words of one contemporary Jesuit, John Haughey at Georgetown, where is the knowing going? Are we advancing the human project? Knowledge without discernment, I believe, is just facts. And as the poet Mary Oliver writes, attention without feeling is merely reporting. Unquote. We don't need more facts or reports. We can all access and get answers from reliable databases and Wikipedia and peer-reviewed journals in a matter of seconds. So much information so effortlessly. Gone are the days where you have to thread the microfiche or go down into the musty stacks or grab, as my grandmother would, the Lincoln Library to solve a dinner table argument. All of us here today at this panel, I'm sure, are going to say that what our culture needs are the tools to interpret facts so that we can make meaning. I would extend that into meaning that is tied to feelings, emotions and ideas which move us at our core. The joy, the bliss of being guided to figure things out on our own. Isn't that why we all got into the humanities to begin with? So what are the habits of mind that are specifically fostered by the humanities? I'm going to speak briefly from my own discipline, studio art. Why everyone should take an art class. 1. You learn independent thinking and how to work independently. You have to do it by yourself, and you have to make it. You have to become a producer rather than a consumer. You can't copy and paste art. Well, you can, but not like from the internet. There are no Spark Notes. There are no internet sites where you can buy a blind contour drawing of the model who comes on Friday night, like those where you can buy custom-written term papers. My students tell me there are even sites which test and rate several online term paper stores to determine where best to spend your cheating dollar. 2, making art requires one to embrace spontaneity, to entertain uncertainty and ambiguity, to deal with complexity. There are no easy answers because so many elements go into a work of art. Beyond subject and content and cultural milieu, every line, shape, value, hue carries a potential meaning that you have to be aware of. The ability to entertain complexity and ambiguity are skills that I believe our society desperately needs. When we focus only on the immediate task, or we only train people in the scientific method, or the business model to control, to assess very specific data, we lose the ability to navigate what are called in England the blue sky questions, the what if questions, and the unknowns. One article I recently read offered that the BP oil disaster and many other disasters like it might have been avoided if they had learned to identify ambiguous threats, those that are outside of the data in front of them. 3, making art forces you to entertain failure. Most of what artists make is awful. Frog, 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 prince. Turd, 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 gem. No one sees most of my failed experiments. Art teaches resilience through repeated failure, and if anybody has spent any time on an academic campus in the last 3 years, we're hearing a lot about resilience, or the lack thereof. Taking an art class is a humbling business. Beginners' drawings and paintings often look terribly awkward, and everybody sees that. You largely make art alone, but it is critiqued in public as a group. The critique takes place in the gap between intention and product. And this, to me, is where the studies of the humanity, this beautiful interplay between the alone and together, satisfies particular needs that few other disciplines can. 4, making art is slow. It's a slow, deep pursuit in a fast, superficial world. The learning that goes into the study and making of art does not lend itself to dashed-off blogs or quickly uploaded Instagrams. The creation of any work of art is time-consuming, painstaking, and lonely. You might be able to make a fantastic expressive gesture drawing in a minute, but that is probably only after many, many hours of failed blobs. In this way, one of the greatest reasons to study both the history of art and the making of it is it is a rich unfolding process. A great painting, like a great novel, does not reveal its meaning to the maker or the viewer in a single glance or a single sitting. It can't really be memorized. It demands time and attention. It is a kind of attention that is the opposite, the exact opposite of tweeting with 140 characters, of internet surfing, of speed reading, of Snapchatting, of online shopping. In this way, art is a challenge to what Adolfo Nicolas, who's the superior general of the Jesuits, calls, quote, the globalization of superficiality of thought, visions, dreams, relationships, convictions, end quote. Making art challenges superficiality by demanding interiority, reflection, alone time. I think one of the greatest challenges of education today is how to promote depth of thought and imagination, a depth that is capable of being transformative. But what really is imagination? Here I quote J.K. Rowling. Imagination is the ability to envision that which is not enabling us to empathize with humans whose experiences we have never shared, end quote. Imagination is not fancy, rather it is a creative process where one's subjectivity runs up and interacts with the experience of the other, whether that is a tree you are drawing, or a poem, or the history of the 1916 rebellion in Ireland. The deep down places where wonder and curiosity and imagination live are really rooms for one. To read a line over and over again for the joy of its sounds, to look up from a novel and envision what it's like to be poor, really poor in another part of the world, to stare at a landscape and try to understand what you are seeing. These are largely alone acts. I believe that one of the reasons why some universities over the last decade have seen an almost 20% drop in the number of undergraduates concentrating in the humanities is because we are raising, or rather we are allowing Apple and consumer culture to raise, a generation which absolutely abhors solitude. My students and my 13-year-old son are truly never alone. They always have their phones with them, their Snapchats, their music, their Facebook accounts. I swear their phones are like their baby blankets. They're like transitional objects. This constant flitting and ADD, the inability to sit with self, is, I believe, a real threat to the unique personhood and ultimately to empathy. When so much of experience is mediated through a screen or a handheld device, I fear that people lose the ability to engage with or really enjoy the reality in front of them, or to see what is hidden. Training ourselves to see what lies beneath the surface is discernment. Art helps us to see what we might have otherwise never have noticed. Education in, to, and by art is essential to the humanities and to our humanity, and without it, we risk staying on the surface. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Sylvia. Sheila, excuse me. She was wearing green. I beg your pardon. All right. Our next panelist is, I think, known to many of you, if not to all of you. Brian Kennedy, originally from Dublin, Ireland, where he completed his studies in history and art history. He has been the assistant director, or was the assistant director of the National Gallery of Ireland, the director of the National Gallery of Australia, the Hood Museum of Art at Dartmouth College, and since 2010, the director of the Toledo Museum of Art. And he asks me to add about him that he is truly delighted to be back in Hanover in such lovely weather. I invite you to welcome Brian Kennedy.
Well, thank you all. Thank you to the OSHER Institute. Thank you to our charming diplomat, Tom Blinkhorn, and our distinguished Professor Edward Bradley, and to all of you, and many faces I recognize, the supporters of the Hood Museum of Art. So let's begin by answering directly the question, what are the humanities? Simply put, they're the study of human culture, studies of human culture. And so the next question that arises, of course, is what is culture? And you're getting a sticky one. But the best explanation that I have heard for the answer to the question, what is culture, is that culture is what we do round here. Culture is what we do round here. So there's no one culture because lots of people do lots of different things round here. But of course there is a dominant culture. It's always been so. So understanding humanity is understanding the what, the how and the why we do what we do round here. So it sounds like a rather important subject to me. Studying human culture makes the humanities important. But we hear a lot that there is a crisis in the humanities. Is there a crisis in the humanities? Well, by general reckoning, the study of human culture, the humanities, has been in precipitous fall for a long time. Today in America, about half of the US undergraduates do 2-year courses. And of those, they're mostly functionally job-related courses. The aim is simply to get a job. It's definitely not to study human culture. Now, the other half of US undergraduates today do 4-year courses. And the numbers doing courses in the humanities, the study of human culture, has dropped from about 75% of all students 100 years ago, and admittedly there are a lot fewer students then than there are now, but to 20% of students 50 years ago, and to less than 10% of students today. So the aim of 4-year courses seems to be coming more and more close to the aim of 2-year courses. Get a job, or make a job. Now, in one sense, of course, there's nothing wrong with this aim. Getting a job is a good thing. What's wrong is that it's become the dominant aim because we need to study human culture and we need to study the humanities. Ben Franklin, great American, wanted us to be both practical and curious, informed and creative, and that imagination should be at the heart of our humanity. Now, it's interesting, some of the great technological leaders of today make the same point. Steve Jobs went to a classic liberal arts college. He went to Reed College in Portland. He actually named his son Reed. He knew that technology without a human purpose, our very need for social interaction, was going to be pointless. And the other great success, I suppose, aside from Apple, is Facebook. And Mark Zuckerberg, you probably know. He studied Greek at Phillips Exeter. And he studied psychology and computer science at Harvard for 2 years before he dropped out. And he emphasized that his extraordinary company, Facebook, has more to do with psychology than it has to do with computer science. We need the humanities. Now, the history of the world is an extraordinary thing. There's only been 3 communications revolutions in the history of the world. One of them occurred 3,000 years ago, the development of cuneiform writing. The second occurred 500 years ago, the development of the printed revolution. And the third has occurred in the last 25 years. But at the same time, something else has happened. The world hit 1 billion people for the first time in 1804. So the whole history of the world, it took us to 1804 to get to 1 billion people. The world hit 4 billion people in 1975, and the world will likely hit 8 billion people in 2025. So we have a huge need to understand human culture. There's a heck of a lot more of us. Now, one thing that's interesting for me is that I've been in the industrial Midwest, post-industrial Midwest now for 6 years. And it's been fascinating to see where the understanding of our human culture, the way that we interact, is growing. And it's in the most successful factories. The Jeep plant, all Jeeps in America have been made in Toledo, Ohio, now for 75 years this year. And that plant is extraordinary. There are 3 plants. There's the robotics plant, that's all robotics, that puts the Jeep more or less together. And then there's the line that has 4,000 people on it on shifts who put all the pieces together. And then there's the paint plant, which is all robotics. Now, in the line, they've got their success of an extraordinarily successful company because a number of years ago, they worked out that all people learn differently. And on the line, people were either tactile, auditory, or visual learners. And the best industrial companies are doing this. They're realizing that our destiny, which is to be an age of artificial intelligence with lots of robots, is to actually be in the world of relationships. It is going to be the capacity to adopt successful behavioral skills, social skills, and communication skills, which is the future of the world as we gain more and more robots. The other thing about the humanities is that the study of human culture, if you really do want to take an interest in humans and the way they do things, and you're curious about it, is that it promotes tolerance because you're actually trying to understand what other people do. It promotes diversity and inclusion. And a world that's gone from 1 billion people to 4 billion people needs this in spades, and we know why. So the humanities should be hugely important to us. But every generation has had blind spots. The study of human culture is somewhat unstudied by humans. And so, for example, in this country, we can have moved from actual slavery to virtual slavery by sharecropping, to a situation today where 5% of the world's population, which is what this country has 20%, over 20% of the world's prisoners. Another form of enslavement. 2.2 million prisoners. And where do we put them? We put them largely in prisons that we can't see, in places that we don't go to. We hide them. And there's been a lot of work done on this. I want to end by saying that one of the more interesting things that's happened over the last 25 years is that the Gallup organization has studied millions of people's reactions to what they think well-being is. At the end of your life, what will it be that will make you feel well? Well, it's the same things throughout your life, but exaggerated, I suppose. But people across the world are concerned about 5 issues, all to do with human culture. They're concerned about their sense of work, job, career, while they have one. They're concerned about the sense of relationship with their family and their friends. They're concerned not with how much they're paid, but whether they feel financially secure. They're concerned about their health. And the 5th is that most of all, they're concerned about being engaged with where they live. You could call it a sense of place, as Seamus Heaney would have said. Or you can call it community. You can call it the gathering of human culture. So there you have it. Everybody should want the humanities because they're about the study of us. And every one of us cares about community, and therefore we should care about the humanities. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian, very, very warmly. Our final panelist is perhaps less known to most of you, but she had a distinguished career at Dartmouth College, is an alumna of the class of 1980. Upon leaving Dartmouth, she went to Yale, where she got her PhD in Italian, and she is currently a professor of Italian at Fairfield University. She also directs the Italian Studies program and teaches all levels of language, Italian literature, and film. She has a special interest in film. Her publications include The Transatlantic Gaze, Italian Cinema, American Film, an examination of the profound and sustained influence of Italian filmmaking on American directors. And then she has asked me to add, somewhat to my own embarrassment, that she still remembers fondly, that does not embarrass me, her time on the Roman Foreign Study program in Italy in the fall of 1979. And she adds, mistakenly I think, or at least with exaggeration, that it was expertly taught by Edward Bradley. So we are very fortunate to have Marianne because, as Tom pointed out to you, Jim's inability to be with us at the very last minute, may I say. His email was entitled Disaster, Disaster. The Titanic has just sunk. But I had invited Marianne here because she has a lot of experience with this kind of gathering, and she has very graciously agreed to read Jim Heffernan's text. So it is not her own text, although she may have some notes to add to it. In any event, I present to you Mary Ann Carolan.
Thank you, and it's an honor to read Jim Heffernan's text, and I wish that were mine. So I begin, or Jim begins. Once upon a time, no one asked why we need to study the humanities, because their value was considered self-evident, just like the value of scientific discovery. 3 months ago, a pair of huge, exquisitely crafted L-shaped antennae in Louisiana and Washington state picked up the chirping echo of 2 black holes colliding in space 1 billion years ago and 1 billion light years away. In that echo, astrophysicists found proof of Einstein's theory of gravitational waves at a cost of more than $1 billion. If you ask why we need this information, what is the use of it, you might as well ask, as Ben Franklin once did, and I quote, "What is the use of a newborn baby?" End quote. Like the potential of a newborn baby, the value of scientific discovery is limitless. It cannot be calculated, and it needs no justification. But the humanities do. Given the staggering cost of a 4-year college education, which is fast approaching $300,000 at institutions like this one, how can we justify the study of subjects such as literature? What sort of dividends does the study of literature pay out there in the real world? Right now, the readiest answer to this question is that it stretches the mind by exposing it to many different perspectives, and thus prepares the student for what is thought to be the most exciting job of our time, entrepreneurship. In William Faulkner's novel, As I Lay Dying, the story of how a rural Mississippi family comes to bury the mother of its children is told from 14 different points of view. To study such a story is to be forced to reckon with the perspectives that are not just different, but radically contradictory, and thus to develop the kind of adaptability that it takes to succeed in business, where the budding entrepreneur must learn how to satisfy customers with various needs, and where he or she must also be ever ready to adapt to the changing needs and changing times. But there's a big problem with this way of justifying the study of of literature. If all you want to learn is entrepreneurial adaptability, you can probably learn it much more efficiently by going to business school. You don't need a novel by Faulkner or by anyone else. On the other hand, you could argue that literature exemplifies writing at its best and thus trains students how to communicate in something other than tweets. To study literature is not just to see the rules of grammar at work, but to feel such things as symmetry of parallel structure and the concentrated force of metaphor, 2 prime instruments of organization. Henry Adams once wrote that nothing in education is more astonishing than the amount of ignorance it accumulates in the form of inert facts. Literature shows us how to animate facts, and still more how to make them cooperate, to work and dance together toward the end of revelation. Yet literature can be highly complex. Given this complexity, given all the ways in which poems and plays and novels resist as well as provoke our desire to know what they mean, the study of literature once again invites the charge of inefficiency. If you just want to know how to make the written word get you a job or make you a sale or charm a venture capitalist, you don't need to study the gnomic verses of Emily Dickinson or the intricate ironies of Jonathan Swift. All you need is a good textbook on writing and plenty of practice. Why then do we really need literature? A traditional claim is that it teaches us moral lessons, which prompts the age-old question, what's the moral of the story? But moral lessons can be hard to extract from any work of literature that aims to tell the truth about human experience, as for instance Shakespeare does in King Lear. In one scene of that play, a foolish but kindly old man has his eyes gouged out. And at the end of the play, the loving daughter that Lear banishes in the first act, the long-suffering Cordelia, dies in his arms along with the old king himself. So even though all the villains in the play are finally punished by death, it is not easy to say why Cordelia must die too, or what the moral of her death might be. Joseph Conrad once declared that his chief aim as a novelist was to make us see. Like Shakespeare, he aimed to make us recognize and reckon with one of the great contradictions of humanity, that only human beings can be inhumane. Only human beings burn people alive, as ISIS has done in our own time. Only human beings gouge people's eyes out, as the Syrian government has done with some of its enemies. Only human beings use young girls as suicide bombers, as Boko Haram did 45 times in the past year alone. As a refugee from such horrors, literature and art alike can offer us visions, or at least glimpses of beauty, harmony, and love. They are a part of what the late Seamus Heaney has called, quote, the redress of poetry, end quote, compensation for the misery, cruelty, and brutality that human beings ceaselessly inflict on one another. But literature at most powerful is never just a balloon ride to fantasy, a trip to the moon on gossamer wings. Rather than taking flight from our inhumanity, great literature confronts it even while somehow keeping alive its faith in our humanity. What is the moral of Toni Morrison's novel Beloved, the story of a formerly enslaved black woman who killed her own infant daughter to spare her from a life of slavery and sexual exploitation? In a world of merciless humanity, can infanticide become an expression of love? This is the kind of question literature insists on asking. At the heart of the humanities lies humanity, which stubbornly insists on measuring everything in terms of its impact on human life. 70 years ago, J. Robert Oppenheimer midwifed the birth of the most destructive weapon the world had ever seen, a weapon that made America invincible, a weapon that ended World War II and thus saved countless American lives. But when we dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, they incinerated over 200,000 human beings, most of them civilians, men, women, and children. That is why Oppenheimer said afterwards, and I quote, "In some sort of crude sense, which no vulgarity, no humor, no overstatement can quite extinguish, the physicists have known sin, and this is a knowledge which they cannot lose," end quote. In saying this, Oppenheimer was not just radically unscientific, even anti-scientific. He was potentially treasonous, disloyal to a government bent on military supremacy above all else. Refusing to join the next heat in the arms race, the hydrogen bomb, Oppenheimer lost his security clearance and spent the rest of his life under a cloud of suspicion. But his response to the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki exemplifies the kind of humanity that the humanities aims to nurture. We need this humanity now more than ever, when the diabolical cruelty of terrorists is compounded by the destructiveness of our very own drone strikes, which hardly ever hit their targets without also striking the innocent, the human life we calmly sacrifice to our military ends. We need literature to bear witness to such sacrifices, not just to the lives we take, but the minds we deform in the process of making war. One of these minds is portrayed in a recent book called Redeployment, a collection of stories about American soldiers in Iraq, written by a young Dartmouth alumnus named Paul Clay. And I quote, "The only thing I want to do," says one lance corporal to a chaplain, "is kill Iraqis. That's it. Everything else is just numb it until you can do something. Killing Hajis is the only thing that feels like doing something, not just wasting time," end quote. Where is the humanity here? This soldier has just enough left to realize that he has been weaponized and turned into a killing machine. Literature strives to speak both for and to whatever shred of humanity may survive the worst of our ordeals. In a novel called The Plague, which he wrote during the Second World War, Albert Camus symbolically portrays the war as a bubonic plague striking an Algerian city. The story is told by a doctor who struggles, often in vain, to save all the lives he can from the hundreds of men, women, and children who die before the plague has run its course. In the end, he says, this tale records what had to be done and what must be, quote, done again in the never-ending fight against terror and its relentless onslaughts, end quote. If these words seem uncannily resonant for our time, consider what the doctor says about how the fight against terror must be waged. Quote, despite their personal afflictions, he says, it must be waged by all who, while unable to be saints, but by refusing to bow down to pestilences, strive their utmost to be healers, end quote. We need literature and the humanities because they strive to heal, to nurture the most priceless of all our possessions, our humanity.
Thank you very much, Marianne. I must say, as I listened to all three of you, I was struck by the fact that you all, in fact, embrace some common themes, that you have the accent you place on protecting and nurturing and investigating our humanity is at the heart of what you're saying, and I think, at the heart of what we're trying to discuss today as a kind of foretaste of what may be another panel discussion on how to respond to need. I think one of our concerns is that this panel discussion not be a little bit like our singing a rousing hymn in church, all verses, with great organ music, the singing of which makes us feel very good to hear our own voices, to hear the voices of others, and then to go forth exhilarated and pleased and leave a church to which no one else ever comes. So we do want to be sensitive to how we may take this wonderful recounting of the precious nature of the humanities and turn it into some kind of substantive form. As I say, that's not on the agenda for today, but I think Tom has promised us that there will be another panel discussion to follow this one that will allow us to discuss such things. I have just a few questions to put to the panelists, unless they wish to speak a little bit to one another, address any queries or criticisms. I don't. Marianne, you want to say something? Yeah.
Just what struck me listening to Brian and also Sheila, all this discussion about technology, and that recently in the press, both Google and others have enlisted literature, their reading literature, to robots, and so in order to teach them proper etiquette and to teach them about relationships and how one should act in society. And so it strikes me that instead of the usual lament as woe is us, people who defend the humanities and believe in its importance, that there are certain ways of understanding that the scientific community, the technological community, understands the importance of literature as well. And another just a friend from my alumni association, my other school, pointed out to me that at Stanford, the computer science program actually pairs with a number of the humanities faculties. So you can major in computer science and classics, for example, in Italian, my field, in French, in German studies, and that instead of remaining in our own little ghetto of the humanities, which of course we think embraces everything because it's about our community, that we need to think strategically as well about how we can bring life and humanity to the sciences.
That's a very important point, and Marianne brought this, the information about the existence of this new and I think very intelligent and flexible major program at Stanford, pairing computer science and the classics, for instance, as oxymoronic as that may seem, a very imaginative and inventive way of looking at bridging the distance between these two disciplines. And my hope is that at some point, some here in this audience, some members of the Dartmouth faculty might be interested in learning about this, and even considering adapting some kind of similar program for Dartmouth. Any other
Just a
comments?
related
Yeah,
thought.
Ron?
I mean, what I think one of the biggest issues that technology companies are facing is how to deal with the fact that people have to relate to each other. So this question of, you know, the why and the what if, the question rather than the answer is, of course, a very humanities way of thinking, so that it's the issue of privacy. And I mean, so many different complexities about what this is about have come to us in just a few years. And it's not fully worked out. It's obviously, at the biggest level, it's how do we relate to the idea that we want to organize ourselves in government, and what rights do we want to give to our government. But what rights do we want to have for ourselves? You know, it's the fact that it's sort of crossing over to celebrity culture and to pop culture, and that some of the biggest activists on this are actually people who exploit, you know, they've got, how many followers has Justin Bieber? I don't know, but a lot. But the concern about, you know, privacy and people's right to their own humanity. So I think that you're getting into some very, very interesting territory that I think is causing the humanities to be coming back to us in different ways. So even if they're actually suffering tremendously in academic culture, I think they're, as I made the point about the G-plant, they're coming back in terms of general culture, because of course how we relate to each other is utterly the important question in the end of the day.
Yeah, thanks.
Just to piggyback on what Marianne was saying, I teach at Boston College, and I'm sure at Fairfield it's similar, that right now there's so much emphasis, which I think is fantastic, on interdisciplinarity and really thinking across the disciplines. And it was interesting, I share a house in Cornish with 66 of my husband's relatives, almost, and there were 15 of us up there this weekend on a work weekend, all of whom, there was one doctor, but he was actually, he was a music major before he became a doctor. The 15 people, every single one of them had been majored in, you know, anthropology, theology, English, classics, Italian studies, art history, lots of art history. And so I said, you know, I have to go give this talk. What, you know, what did you take out of you're all studying, what did you take out of it? You know, 5 years out, 10 years out, 40 years out, 50 years out. And across the board, they all said, which I thought was so interesting, the ability to translate across disciplines, the ability to speak different languages, the ability to use different hermeneutic systems, to be able to use the methodologies or language or vocabulary of one profession or group and to be able to make the leap to another one. That was what they all took away. So.
Good, thanks. I would like to address to you all, briefly, I hope, two questions prompted by two texts that I find especially important for me. As someone whose training was in classical literature, I obviously have read and been impressed by and taught what I always thought was the kind of creedal statement that justifies our all being here at Dartmouth College and other places of higher learning, namely Socrates saying in chapter 38b of the Apology, when he's admonished that he should really give up his questioning of his fellow Athenians, he says, this is the hardest thing of all for you to understand. If I say that this would be disobedience to God, that is to say, the inner voice he has to give up his questioning, and why I cannot mind my own business, you will not believe me. You'll think I'm pulling your leg. If, on the other hand, I tell you that to let no day pass without discussing goodness, and the word here in Greek is arete, which suggests something rather stronger than goodness, excellence, moral excellence, among other things, and all the other subjects about which you hear me talking and examining both myself and others is really the very best thing that a man can do, and that life without this sort of examination is not worth living, you will be even less inclined to believe me. Now, when he says not worth living, he's not suggesting that people commit suicide if they can't follow his precepts. But the notion is that a life unexamined is simply not one that is, really the Greek suggests more, livable for a man. Not possible. Doesn't make life possible. All right, there's Socrates. Is this creedal statement just so passé, as it were, that we've moved on from that as a kind of central exhortation to ourselves and to our students onto other purposes, other practices? Any one of you?
You talked about discernment.
Sheila, go ahead.
Again,
Sheila.
I'm very lucky that I can reach into all of the Jesuit sound bites, which I've really come to. I didn't know how much I believed until I taught there for 13 years. And I mentioned the superior Nicholas, and in it he talks about sort of, you know, would Jesuits, if they were doing it all over again, would they even be in the business of higher education now? Would that be where their mission is? And if there's a failure to privilege emotion and interpretation and creativity and meaningful communication, and empathy and imagination about others, the very stuff of the humanities, that the tools needed to allow what the Jesuits called humans to flourish, the human project, that failure to do so actually reduces the world to a complete economic global jungle, where it's survival of the fittest, and in academia we're completely relegated to the role of providers of professional and technical skills that allow our students to compete for the best and most lucrative jobs. That said, I'm lucky that I teach at a university where people don't shy away from the notion of cura personalis, or what moral excellence is. And I think that's difficult in many institutions of higher institution. There's almost an embarrassment, you know, to talk about, or even make a stab at truth, what truth means in various disciplines, or what moral excellence is. So,
good. That's good. Brian?
The thought that strikes me is that, coming from the world of art museums, many people on our boards are business leaders. I mean, they've been in leadership of one kind or another. And the leadership section of bookstores is a growing thing. So this concern with, you know, what's the right thing to do, and how to manage people, and how to manage networks, is really focused on that sense of moral excellence, which is how to manage yourself. And I think that it's interesting. I'm trying to unpack this, and I don't like to believe in crisis, really. It's just not a happy way to live, you know. I mean, certainly it looks like the humanities are in crisis, but on the other hand, maybe they've just moved, right? And so something like business leadership and all of this is really about the humanities. And we're getting a whole, you know, lot of new publications which are essentially about these issues, but they're occurring in a different place. Anyway, I just put that as a possible thought. Is it that the classics have moved into Tuck Business School?
Marianne, you want to say something?
If only. I teach Dante, and it's one of the most challenging topics for me to teach. And I don't know why, probably because I'm a little crazy, but I teach all 3 canticles. I teach 100 canti. I teach the whole shebang in one semester, because otherwise it's not a comedy. You end in most colleges and universities, you just teach the Inferno, or you teach all 3 of the Inferno, Purgatorio, and Paradiso for the entire year. But it wasn't going to work. I'd get students for Inferno, but I don't know how many people would sign up for the Purgatorio and Paradiso, especially Paradiso, which is very difficult to understand and teach, quite frankly. So I find it to be a humbling experience, because Dante is truly a genius, and I feel humble and you know, humiliated in front of this wonderful text. But it is an incredible opportunity for students to think about their own journeys, whether it's a journey of faith or not. And Fairfield University, for those of you who don't know, is also Catholic Jesuit school. And if you want to see a number of students who really want to be at BC, come to Fairfield. They want to be at your school. No, but I have wonderful students as well. But I tell them that in the beginning of the great poem, Dante says, in the beginning of our lives, I found myself lost. You have to participate in this reading. This is not something that you read like a novel and you put it down and then you pick it up a couple of days later or the next morning or whatever. Dante exhorts you to be involved in this journey as well. And I ask them to kind of come along on this spiritual journey and to engage with it. I also do, when we get to the end of Inferno, we have this kind of fun exercise of putting public figures in hell. You know, like choose your favorite three. I have to tell them, not your classmates, not your parents or your brother or sister for this point. But so I find that, you know, that's all about an examination.
Yeah. Good. I have one final question. I'm glad that Sheila mentioned her Jesuit colleagues and so on, because this is a quotation from Thomas Merton, though not a Jesuit, but in an essay entitled On Love and Living, he says, and I'm going to compress a little bit, the function of a university is then, first of all, to help the students discover themselves, to recognize themselves, and to identify who it is that chooses. And he goes on to say, to put it in even more outrageous terms, and this is now my comment addressed to the panelists, the function of the university is to help men and women save their souls, and in so doing to save their society. From what? From the hell of meaninglessness, of obsession, of complex artifice, of systematic lying, of criminal evasion and neglects, of self-destructive futilities. I put before you Thomas Merton. Anyone want where do we fit him in? Where do we fit him in?
Everywhere. Love Thomas Merton. Love. I started first before. Do you want to?
No, go ahead.
Brian, do you want to go with Thomas?
Oh, you want me? I'm happy to continue
Yeah.
my
I'm having
line
a pool of thoughts.
So what strikes me about the two passages that you selected, Edward, is that they're about morality and about ethics. And as you said, we shy away from that at the university. We think that maybe that's your personal business. But isn't literature really all about figuring out who's good and who's bad, the good guys and the bad guys? And as Jim Heffernan said in his remarks, you know, sometimes we don't understand why things happen the way they do. Sometimes we don't understand why they happen in life and why the good die young, for example. We don't understand this, but we struggle with it, and that's part of our humanity. I don't think that we can be human without a moral, ethical sense.
Tom,
This is Diane? Anyway, I think you can hear me. In addition to our distinguished guests today, we have one member of the audience who is very, very special. She is from Romania. She's a Dartmouth student, and she has written about this subject in the Dartmouth. And I wonder if Ioana Solomon would like to say anything about what you've heard this afternoon.
Sure. Yeah, and what you've experienced, Ioana, your own experience, and what you can take from it and even make.
Thank you so much for that. And thank you for coming and for sharing very profound and very compelling thoughts, in my opinion. So the reasons and the evidence you've given for... Talk into it, please. Sorry. The evidence and the reasons you've given for the decline in the pursuit of humanities are consistent with a trend I've observed among my peers, which is that we tend to choose classes and choose majors and choose opportunities for off-term or for summers based on our career goals and based on our career objectives. And there's there's a tendency to refer to arts and humanities classes as layups or as classes you take to get an easy grade, or and this isn't something I personally believe, it's just something I've noticed, a part of the culture that I've noticed developing. And I feel like that's even more worrisome if students who chose to come to a liberal arts institution are beginning to think in more vocational terms and are beginning to sort of force the vocational education framework within the liberal arts framework, and are beginning to see humanities subjects as less practical. So my question for you is, what do you think we can do, faculty, alumni, students who do believe you and who are pursuing humanities subjects, the Dartmouth administration, the administration of other top colleges, what do you think are some potential solutions to sort of reverse this dangerous trend and to bring humanities to the place where they should stand in our educational goals and objectives?
Thank you. It's a great question.
Any one of our panelists wish to comment on that?
Or anyone in the audience.
I think it's time for us now to more or less turn the floor over to all of you and invite your questions and observations. And my hope would be that someone here, I know there are 2 or 3 members of the faculty, more than that, there are a few members of the faculty, not quite as many as I had hoped would be here. Obviously, in the light of Joanna's comments, it would have been wonderful if a dean or 2 had been here to hear. I beg your pardon? Heaven forfend. Yeah, heaven forfend. But anyway, now is your opportunity to address questions to the panelists, or in fact to respond, if you can, to Joanna's very legitimate and I think poignant query. If you haven't read it, she wrote an excellent essay in the student newspaper, the Dartmouth, this past Monday, am I right? Tuesday. A week ago, yeah.
I don't know what the structure of the curriculum at Dartmouth is, but I know in many colleges, beautiful liberal arts colleges, it seems to me probably beginning with the top down, there's been an abdication from the original purposes of the Voice in the Wilderness to raising money and building buildings and competing with other universities and winning students by creating courses that study early on what they want to study. And it seems to me in my day, we came to learn from experiences that were structured to begin with. We had required courses. I had to take an art course, and bless them, I did. I had to take a early science course, and I took astronomy because I was afraid of chemistry, but I did take chemistry later on, almost failed. But it changed my life because it was something I received there from great teachers. I was a political science and major and had only my senior course to take, but I took a course in the philosophy of the state my junior year, and it moved me because suddenly I saw what it was all about. I saw that I was offered different ways of organizing my experience. So much was coming so fast that I changed my major and took 8 philosophy courses. Then I taught philosophy. It changed my life, and I'm indebted forever to that because they put me in that early structure, spread me out, gave me experiences I wouldn't have had if I had been making the choices to begin with. And the president was around the campus. We could go see him. And I know the pressures, economic pressures of having winning football teams and so forth is great now. But if we want the humanities, it isn't in buildings and in competition. It's in the wonderful interplay of a brilliant mind who cares and a young person who wants to learn. It's Mark Hopkins on the log, and it's what it's about. And it's coming to grips with who you are and who you want to be with the help of someone who can direct you a bit.
Yeah. So if I could respond, since I advised a number of students, and have to tell you that, I think that the universities have their exigencies as well, but that our current students are under a tremendous amount of pressure. Whether we were, I can't remember, it was that long ago that I don't remember anybody, they probably figured it out and all went to work in the banks, because that's where most of my class went anyway. I was a government major, but then for a case of incredible serendipity, which involved a guy who left an oar under the bed in the apartment that I was living in, I found out about a classics foreign study program, and then I had my accomplice in crime, my good friend Peggy, and we went to talk to this man 2 weeks into the spring term of junior year, changed 2 of our 3 courses, and went to Rome. I mean, what, don't do this at home kind of thing. So I lived it, and I try to instill that in my students and say, take what you're interested in, follow your heart. But oftentimes they don't know what their heart is. I mean, I didn't know what my heart was. I didn't know I had no inclination of becoming a professor whatsoever. I thought I was going to law school after having a good time. I mean, I'm a professor. Sometimes I can't believe it. But so I try to tell my students this story because they feel an enormous amount of pressure. And it's financial, it's the economic reality, which is different from when I got out of college. It's a different generation. They come loaded with all of this sense of guilt about how much it costs. And they don't just have a major, they have a double major, sometimes a triple major, and then 3 minors. And I think, how can you concentrate on anything? How can you have a thought? I mean, never mind, they're never alone. I mean, the conversations we have in class about phones and would they turn them off, and it's boring. You don't want to hear about that.
Yeah.
But I think that there's such external pressure from these kids.
Yeah, I think Brian and Sheila want
Oh, yeah,
to say.
okay.
Yeah, just briefly, I remember the first time I heard President Jim Wright say that we'd moved into the era of certification, not education. That I was hugely affected. And then I started to pick up other things. I remember talking to a very distinguished head of a business school, and I asked him, has any one of your people ever gone to lead a non-profit? And he said, yeah, we had somebody like that once. And then I'd talk with all these alumni, and they'd tell me, very distinguished people in all different careers, they'd tell me about the course they did in oceanography, or with Churchill Lathrop, or the courses that changed their lives. The ones that change their lives. And so I think you've got a real point that it's about leadership. It's about having the courage of our convictions. And even in my own profession as an art museum director, there was a time when art museum directors wrote books about why art museums were important. And now we're so busy running our art museums that we don't write the book. So I think the challenge is to our faculty and to our leadership to literally lead the fight to the people.
Yeah. I would just piggyback on that. I think once you get the students to take beyond an intro level class, many of them are actually hooked. It's getting them there. And I think in a kind of devilish way, we actually sadly have to make the case for the useful knowledge aspect of the humanities to get them there before they can internalize the beauty of the liberal knowledge. And there's a lot to be said for the useful knowledge, too. I mean, I sort of skipped over that, but when I think of, we have a big question at BC where we have a huge philosophy, PhD program in philosophy. Okay, what do you do with graduating 20 philosophy PhDs? Where do they get the jobs? They're just not out there. Our PhD philosophies, especially in continental philosophy, in the last couple of years, more of them are running NGOs than they are teaching philosophy. They're running an NGO in Israel. Another just started the Balkans Peace Center. Another is the dean of a newly minted college, a university which studies the relationship between philosophy and art. My students, 75% of my freshman drawing class are pre-med. And I'll never forget last year, my favorite student, Chris Chung, he had the Midas touch. He could draw anything. He was brilliant. He could compute anything. He could do everything. He was incredibly sensitive, thoughtful, wrote beautifully. And he said, Professor Gallagher, will you write me a recommendation for grad school? And I said, oh, be totally delighted. And then in my mailbox comes Rutgers School of Dentistry, sort of Mason Gross School of Oral Hygiene, and I thought like, oh. But then I thought, yay, right? Then I thought, yay, that what our administration doesn't know, what our parents don't know, what a lot of our students, actually undergraduates, don't know too, is that our students, our best students in the humanities, actually are becoming doctors, are starting robotics companies, are running NGOs, and are really learning how to write. And if you look at the employment statistics for Silicon Valley, the long-term growth isn't with the engineers and the computer scientists, it's with the art history majors and anthropologists and gender studies majors who are going to be the marketers and the educators and the trainers, essentially all of the people who can tell a story. And that's what we do best. Yeah.
I do want to keep questions coming from the audience, if possible. This gentleman has one, and then there's a man in the back there. Yeah. You first, sir.
Sir, thank you, Edward. One comment, students are under pressure because of the cost of college. It doesn't have to cost that much. If the colleges had their eyes and their intentions fixed on learning and the joy of learning, I think most of the tuition goes for purposes which actually war against the humanities. Second comment, I worry a bit about our praising the humanities without defining what we really mean by the humanities. Let us remember where the study of the humanities came from the rediscovery of the past. And it seems to me that what has happened to the humanities is they have drifted more and more to the study of the day before yesterday. And I think that's injurious. That instead of entering a different world and a different set of values, which one can do through art, through literature, what we are doing is cleaving to the familiar, and I think that is very dangerous. Third, there's so much emphasis in the discussion here on utility. I'm reminded of one of my colleagues, a man who was a survivor of the Holocaust. One day he had been an actor and he had to leave Germany because his mother was, I think, 1/4 Jewish or something like that. And then he somehow found himself in a PhD program and he was teaching literature. And I walked past his classroom one day and he said, well, my German accent is very bad, so I'll probably drop it halfway through. He says, well, you know, you study, you want to become successes. He said, well, you want to be a success, you're in the wrong building, you should go over there. And he pointed to the social sciences building. They will teach you how to manipulate, how to make people buy things they don't want. You know, and you will be a great success. Over in this building, we teach you how to fail. Now, the students didn't understand that. But it takes a while, and you do understand that the study of the past, the study of societies, of aspirations that are different from the ones that surround us, are quite liberating and enable us to fail with a certain degree of honor because finally we all fail. And I worry about this sense of study the humanities and it will be useful. And certainly the sense that if you study the humanities, you will be more moral. Let's stop for a moment and think of the great horror of the past century. It came out of the most cultural, most humanistically inclined country in Europe. And that society was able to put 6 million people in ovens and to kill them, a horrendous thought that is hard to speak. And if the study of the humanities and literature brought one to a greater moral refinement, then one has only to look at English departments and see the fallacy of that. Okay, I'm over.
Perversion of morality.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
I said the perversion of moral values is not a reason to.
We have one over here.
We have first. Over here, and then this gentleman back there, his hand has been up a lot.
This gentleman over here. Okay, go ahead.
Okay. So I have been reading some op-eds that have been criticizing or that have been questioning the relevance of the humanities today. And a recurring theme that I noticed is the claim that the humanities today are immersed in political correctness and dogmaticism. And do you think there's anything to this criticism, or do you think these are just curmudgeons who refuse to accept that society has changed, or is this an exaggeration?
Good question. Who wants to begin?
I'll take it on because I constantly have to tell my father this. My father is like right of Charlemagne, and you know, it's constantly saying like, Boston College isn't really a Jesuit university. It's not really Catholic, and you know, nobody who's conservative can get a job there, and blah blah blah. And I have to tell him, Dad, it doesn't come up that much when I am teaching a student how not to put, you know, their turpentine with their water. You know, Donald Trump, it doesn't come up. It doesn't come up. And I know for my friend, the geologist, who is saying, this is how you tell something is 4.5 billion years old. This is how you can tell something is 4.3 billion years old. There's a huge part where sort of political correctness and you know, some stranglehold of liberal thinking, which my father thinks is happening in the university, I don't see it. I mean, maybe I'm a crazy liberal, but
I'll just say briefly, I mean, we live in challenging times, there's no doubt about it, because we haven't quite worked out what we mean by the way that our legal system is developing. And so we've moved in a very short period of time from, you know, an era of civil and then social rights to mid-20th century human rights, and now we're the era of cultural rights. And cultural rights mean what people do around here, recognizing that we all do different things around here, and now we all have rights about the things that we do around here. And it's very, very complicating in a society that has exploded in population, but has also become super connected in ways that it never was before, in a very, very short period of time. So I think we, you know, and I feel part of this, that, you know, we're an art museum is a place for all religions and none, all politics and none. We say, but it's also the most Caucasian of all cultural institutions in this country still. And we've got a lot of issues to deal with. And so it's unpacking itself, and it will be throughout my lifetime. We just haven't lived in that period. So there's not answers really, we're searching for ways to deal with things that have just come upon us, and I think will increasingly come upon us as we give people who have lots of different ways of doing things increasingly similar rights.
In some ways, I think that, I mean, I agree with Sheila that politics, well, and obviously when you teach Dante, it comes up all the time because he was exiled for his politics. So but we're talking about something that is not political correctness as we know it. I think in some ways what is more damaging to the humanities, or some of the trends that have been more damaging, has been a distance from the text, whether it be a poem or a novel or a film. And that has created, at least when I was in graduate school in the 1980s, it was as if you were always talking about what the theorist said, and you forgot what the text was. And I mean, that's a trend that's kind of gone away insofar as there's not a lot of theory taught, but that's where you can, I mean, and then there are politicized theories, of course, in the way of looking at a piece of literature or film. But I always try to bring my students back to whatever text I'm teaching, just to keep them honest and to have them consider, you know, not what they think, but what they read, what the author said.
A brief comment, Mr. McGowan, on this question. I think it's entirely appropriate. I think that there was a kind of quiet revolution that took place on the American university scene in maybe the mid-'80s, in which all of the elite institutions like Dartmouth recognized that they were in stiff competition with one another for a special group of students. And they began to devote themselves to the marketing of the institutions and demonstrating to prospective students how they could do certain things better. Now, more often than not, what they could do better took on physical form. And I remember being very much struck by the fact that many, many years ago, Middlebury College established a Ben & Jerry's ice cream parlor that was open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and the ice cream was free. And then the Chronicle of Education points out that some universities built Olympic-sized swimming pools. So universities that were not especially distinguished, and enrollments soared. So then there was a recognition that no consumer, and I want to tell you that in the early 90s, the chairman of the board of trustees of Dartmouth College, at a meeting which I was present, said to the students, "You are the customers here. You are the customers. You're the consumers here." All right. So as that developed, then institutions had to create all kinds of offices and services and functions that were designed to make everyone feel happy. The contented consumer, I really mean that. And the result of this has been, as many of you know, an enormous burgeoning of the administrative staff of Dartmouth College and places like it across the nation, because there are certain kinds of offices that weren't even imagined when most of you were in college that now are absolutely necessary to protect students from any untoward experience. I'm exaggerating slightly, but you can't know how true what I say is. Those of you who are students here and remember building bonfires, I'll just take this as an instance of the kind of growing infantilization that has overtaken Dartmouth and other places like it. Those of you will remember, to be sure, there was a certain kind of foolhardiness in your work. You didn't wear helmets, you didn't have gloves, you collected flotsam and maybe old rail ties that were saturated with creosote. All right, that probably was not the right way to do it. But the contemporary way is now to have engineers with forklifts and hard hats and a security cordon around the bonfire while it's being built, and an EMS ambulance nearby in case of, who knows, a splinter, a fall. No, I really mean this. Now we laugh, but it is an expression of an evolution that manifests itself in more serious ways, in the way in which we do want to make certain that we are in every way correct and that no one can say that person violated my safe space by introducing Ovid's Metamorphoses in class, where there are stories of how gods ravished, read rape, nymphs, and heaven forbid that we should read the Hebrew Bible, and above all, Exodus, with some of the murderous stories there where Moses orders the Levites to execute, to kill those who worship the golden calf, and 3,000 of them were slaughtered. So that's what we're facing. Sorry for that.
Okay, this gentleman here has been waiting patiently.
Thank you so much for hosting this discussion. So, as a member of the class of 2001, I majored in environmental studies with architecture. And I actually work now as an arborist, mostly back in Seattle, but now that I've moved back here, my office is literature free, as in very little text, not much speaking. So I find that the humanities are essential to my process in the scientific realm, in that it provides a creativity for the best questions, usually why or why not. So my question is relating to Dartmouth and being back home, and as the former co-chair of Paleopolis Senior Society, why is it that our alma mater is written in the third person plural as opposed to the first person plural? The they instead of we.
What's your reference?
So the lyrics now are, they have the still north in their hearts, as opposed to we have the still north in our hearts.
What to think about that one?
I mean, that's a tough one.
You don't have an answer to that? Can you answer his question? Okay, well, I got a gentleman up here with the microphone. Did you want to say something first? And then we'll go over there.
Sure, thank you very much. Professor, I think you hit it right on the head with the problems that we're having here on campus and that other universities are experiencing. And I was interested to read in the Valley News this morning, the Secretary of Education was holding high schools to task for not having enough art studies, language studies, so forth. I think the problem goes well beyond the freshmen coming in, or I'm sorry, the first years. coming into these schools, it starts with the parents and their parents. I think we need to go back a lot deeper because these kids are being challenged in the wrong way.
Okay, did you want to say something or have a question? Sure, yeah, I'd like to. Thank you. Hi.
Jim Murphy. I teach in the government department here at the college, and I guess I'm responding in main part to Jim Heffernan's address. So he's not here, of course, but if someone could channel him, that would be handy. Because I think Jim Heffernan and the other panelists, but especially thinking of Heffernan's speech, made a very eloquent case for the value of humanistic study, especially in his case, study of literature. But I wish that it had gone a step further, that is, just because something is very valuable, is a fundamental part of any human being's education, right, that in itself doesn't mean that it should be part of a college curriculum. That is, universities can't do everything, and so we have to, for those of us who want to defend the study of humanities, we have to defend what's the value added by them being studied in colleges and in classrooms, because obviously people have studied literature and enjoyed it and benefited from it quite apart from any university setting. And in fact, the kind of questions, the wonderful questions that Jim asked of the texts he discussed, the kind of probing questions about the human meaning of those texts, are questions I think often they're more likely to come up in an informal book group than they are to come up in a university classroom. So I think it's not enough to praise the value and importance of these kinds of studies. We have to talk about and defend why they're fundamental to the classroom experience is fundamental to them, why the scholastic study of those subjects is important and fundamental, when we all know that to scholasticize a topic can be a good way to kill it.
Mm-hmm. I would
go ahead.
Just like to, I think it's a very important point, and one that universities are really starting to address. When most of us got our PhDs, you just maybe had one class in being a graduate assistant teacher, a TA, but you really didn't learn how to teach. And more universities, and I think this is a good move, are having centers for teaching excellence. And what's coming out of that is pretty obvious, that how you teach is as important as what you teach. The person that you are modeling to the students in the classroom has an incredible impact on how they are learning. And just to pick up on what you said about what's the value added of doing it in the classroom, it's a little bit of what I talked about in my talk, that I think there's still a very special thing that happens in the classroom, which we know does not happen on online learning. 10 years ago, there was so much online learning stuff going on, and now it's really hushed up quite a bit. This intersection and this interplay between being alone and the solitude of a close reading or making a piece of artwork or studying history, and then going back to a group and fleshing those ideas out in an environment with other people. I think that's something that's incredibly, I know in my own experience when I think back at the classes that most influenced me, it wasn't the large lecture classes, it wasn't the labs, it was those classes.
And I would also say, why should anything be in a college curriculum? I mean, why should government? You teach my major. Why do we need, why can't we just sit around and talk about it? I mean, when I think about the humanities, I think the greatest defense for them is to imagine a world without the humanities. Imagine a world where you couldn't conceive of anything unless you experienced it. You can't understand what someone else is going through, so you have no empathy. You're really trapped in the here and now in your limited experience. And I think that that's the real hell. So that's the world without humanities.
Bill Sullivan.
Brian wanted just to add a comment.
Brian, go ahead.
Do I have to press this?
Wait a minute. Brian is going to say something.
Oh, sorry. Okay. I'm a little bit concerned about the idea that, knowledge for its own sake is a beautiful thing, certainly, right? But people go to college and there's an application, there's an applied knowledge that we're looking for. And I think it's for us in the humanities to find ways to apply the knowledge to human need today. And I've been fascinated as we've grown work that started here at the Hood in Toledo, and it's starting to happen throughout the country, that you look at what Jim Heffernan said about the importance of the humanities in healing. You know, that we're having to heal ourselves, hopefully to improve the things that we do that damage. And there's such an incredible amount of damage caused. But it's caused by people who have, in an increasingly legalistic world, got lots of rule books. So whether it's airbags, or BP in the Gulf, or lead in the water in Flint, Michigan, or whatever, there's a huge need for safety management. And what you're finding with corporations, and this is why I say I have real confidence that there's something happening here in our leadership in business, that they're realizing that, you know, the rule book doesn't work. What works is sensory knowledge and sensory application. Do you actually see that the water is green, and how green does it have to be before you stop drinking it? And so I think that there's a necessity for us, particularly in the arts and humanities, to learn how to apply our knowledge and find those spaces in between where we can help to improve our world and to heal it.
Well said. Bill, did you want to ask a question or make a statement?
Yeah. I was a major in German language and German literature, and I expanded that into German history and to European history in my days in college. But it didn't stop there. It kept going. I lived in Germany for a total of about 6 years throughout my different careers. Okay. And what it taught me was, I mean, the inquisitiveness was there, but how to go and examine a culture, how to go and examine a people, how to learn how they thought, how they think, and to expand that. All the tools you learn while you're in the process of doing that and living in another country to other cultures, and to broaden your mind, to broaden your horizons about what is going on in the world, and to know how to look at them in a very learned and inquisitive and informed way. That did everything for me. And it hasn't stopped. It continues to this day. That's the value of humanities to me.
I've been struck by, I'm not sure that I quite understood a lack of concern about a body of knowledge. And if I misinterpreted you, forgive me. But I'm thinking of a college like St. John's, the great books college, where the students learn a certain body of knowledge. And when you read their prospectus about the fields in which they all enter, it ranges, medicine, science, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we need to really remember that there are eternal verities and bodies of knowledge that are very important. Sylvia and I were talking before we started about the fact that we at Vassar College took Art 105, year-long introduction to art. And it was one of the most valuable courses I think I ever took, and stays with me forever. So I really want to make a brief for that body of knowledge that I think is inspirational and important.
Thank you very much. I just want to mention something that Edward said at the beginning, which is that this is not just a one-off panel, as exciting as it has been, and we're most grateful to everyone for coming, but we want to build on this, and we want your ideas about what comes next. So Edward and I and Jim and others are going to be thinking about how do we make this operational? What kinds of specific suggestions might be tested on a pilot basis with the college or elsewhere to try to build on the very, very valuable exchanges that we've had here today? I think we have an opportunity at least in one area, and that is the college is moving into the whole area of houses, housing clusters, in which there is a professor, a housing cluster. It seems to me, and Sylvia and I and Edward tomorrow morning are going to be meeting with a couple of the professors in these houses to see what can we do to work together. OSHER, with people who are still intellectually alive and have a lot of experience. How can we collaborate with each other and try to build in a constructive way on some of the ideas and some of the challenges that have been mentioned here today? Anything else?
Yes. Thank you, Tom Blinkhorn. I have a confession to make to you before we end this wonderful occasion. I was a little discouraged before we began by a number of factors. I had full confidence in the panelists, but I didn't know, frankly, that there would be as generous an audience as there is. I was worried about that because most people don't have an attention span that will take them for this length of time. So that has been a wonderful, wonderful revelation to me, or confirmation of what I had hoped. I have been enormously impressed by the panelists. I knew they were good. I knew that. I found them to be just excellent in every wonderful way. So I would want just to add a word to what Thomas said about another occasion in which we'll try to move, Tom failed to say I'm an emeritus professor. I have no status other than the privileges that Tom extends to me. But maybe we can encourage members of the faculty in the humanities to be bold enough to speak up. I'm impressed by the inertia, the supine nature of so many humanists who just don't know or don't care or don't dare to speak up in defense of what they truly believe we should be about in our classrooms. And may I say, just in closing, I want to honor Jim Murphy, who spoke, I thought, very well. He has been working for a long time in an attempt to persuade colleagues here on the faculty to consider some kind of a curriculum that would be founded in all of the branches of the humanities, not to replace engineering and mathematics and chemistry and all of that, but to complement or to work in tandem with that. And Jim has very, very generously, graciously made available texts of one of his blueprints. He doesn't suggest that this is going to be everything for everyone and do it all, but at least it is a concrete step forward to help us think our way through to reorganizing the humanities in a more vital and dynamic sense into the curriculum of the college than they currently enjoy.
I forgot to say at the beginning that this whole session is being taped, and we will produce cassettes, but it's also going to be on YouTube. And maybe even Sheila will show us a few more of her slides to include with it. So listen, thank you very much for coming.